I don't want no oil a-spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus and Bowling Green, and hello to those of you listening on the internet wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I am the host this week of For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and your family and your garden plants and the trees and the forests and the fish and the streams and the birds in the air and the little crawly things under the ground. Pretty much everybody and everything, because, like it or not, we are all here trapped on this beautiful planet called Earth. And we've got a really interesting show lined up for you today. But first, before I get into it, just a word about what's going on here hosting-wise. I am not allowed to host this show when it airs on our commercial station where we usually air the program. And the reason is that the company that owns that station has decided that it would be a violation of something called the equal time law. That if I'm allowed to broadcast on the radio, then they have to give an equal amount of time to my political opponents, since I am in the process of running for mayor of Bowling Green, Ohio. Now, it's really questionable. Their interpretation of the law is many people, including lawyers I've talked to, disagree with it, mostly because we actually purchased that hour. And all the law says is you have to give an equal opportunity. So my opponents would also be able to purchase an hour. But it's their corporation, so they've made the decision. And that's why on the radio version, you're going to hear Shehbaz Khan. And Shehbaz does a fine job hosting on the radio. But this week we're trying something different, because the internet... the YouTube, where we have our YouTube channel, and podcasts, where I broadcast the podcast version of the show, they are not bound by the equal time law at all. So I am allowed to host on the internet version of this program, and so that's what I'm going to do. And then what we'll do is we'll give Shehbaz the script from this recording, and that's what he will broadcast on Sunday morning on our live program on 100.7 FM, The Ticket in Toledo. So, anyway, that's why you're hearing me instead of just hearing Shehbaz read a script that I wrote. So, last week we gave sort of not an in-depth look at, but a good rundown of a lot of the biggest nuclear power scandals in recent times, the billions and billions of dollars that the nuclear industry has gotten through bribes and kickbacks and and all kinds of corrupt things. Now, here in Ohio, we have been covering something called HB 434, and HB 434 was a proposal put forward by Dick Stein, a representative from District 54. And Dick Stein is the fellow who was chairing the House Bill 6 committee hearings, the initial ones that got that horrible, corrupt bill, which was the result of bribery and kickbacks. He's the one who chaired the committee hearings at the very beginning that got that bill out of committee and over to the House to vote. And actually, I often tell a story about how the first speaker at that hearing that was supposed to be the opponents was a representative of American Electric Power, and they said, oh, well, we're not necessarily opposed to this, but we look forward to working with the legislature to make it better. And at that point, it was Dick Stein. He was the chair of the committee, and Dick Stein leaned forward, drooling, and said, oh, yes, we definitely look forward to working with you. And the next week, what was supposed to have been a global warming, combating global warming bill, suddenly had bailouts for 2 coal plants stuck in it. 2 coal plants that were owned by AEP. So that's a little bit about Dick Stein. And he's been pushing this House Bill 434 this is the 4th attempt. And what it does is it creates what's called a nuclear authority. And the way his bill was written, this nuclear authority, which would have been made up of a panel of nuclear industry executives who would serve on this authority while they were still employed in the nuclear industry, would have all regulatory authority over anything having to do with nuclear power, radiation, nuclear wastes, where to dump them, what kind of approving designs for nuclear plants. In other words, it was completely taking authority away from the government to do any of those things, and literally giving it to the industry executives that the government is supposed to be regulating. It's direct government by corporation. That's how HB 434 was written. And in fact, there's no, in the original HB 434, there is no way for the public to comment on anything they're doing or even know what they're doing, because their meetings would not have to be open to the public. None of their decisions would be published anywhere. Basically, they could operate pretty much in secret without any kind of oversight by any government agency, the legislature, and certainly not the people of Ohio. And so it was a horrible, horrible bill. In fact, it was so horrible that the last time we reported on it, we were quite happy because it failed to get out of the Senate committee. It died in committee, which was great news. We were very happy to report on that. Unfortunately, what happened is Dick Stein stuck it into the budget bill, and that was a multi-thousand page bill. It got up to 9,100 pages. It started out at like 5,000 pages. The final version had about 6,200 pages, and it had this House Bill 434 in it. So, in other words, they could not pass it using the normal legislative procedures, because whenever they opened up to hearings, people would come forward and point out all the obvious flaws of letting corporations run themselves and ceding all government authority to the very same corporate executives, the same kind of corporate executives that gave us the whole House Bill 6 scandal. In other words, the same level corporate executives that wrote the checks for the bribes that Larry Householder and Matt Borges are going to prison for. Those are the ones who would be appointed to this panel. In other words, control the nuclear industry in Ohio. So the governor has a line item veto. And even though this bill, or this part of the bill, was pulled out of the Senate version of the budget, it was still in the House version. And now we had assumed that because it wasn't in the Senate version, it wouldn't survive the Reconciliation Committee, the one that took the two very different House and Senate budgets and melded them together into one budget. But it did. So even though we had lobbied the Senate to take it out of their budget, and they did, because the House kept it in their version, it stayed in the bill and actually got passed. So the governor has what's called a line item veto, and he really went to work on this part of the budget bill. Oh, and of course the 6,000 page budget bill was just full of terrible legislative things that could not pass through the normal legislative process because they were so bad, like SB 83, which we've reported on before. SB 83 got stuck into the budget bill and is now law. State teachers have to teach global warming denial alongside of global warming science and aren't allowed to tell students the difference between the two. So that's horrible. But the governor used his line item veto extensively on this part of the budget bill. In fact, he made 30 edits to it, and it took us a while to figure out what exactly the sum effect of all those edits were. And it looks like at this point, we're recording this on July 6th. It looks like at this point what has happened is he took away the regulatory authority from the Ohio Nuclear Development Authority. So it doesn't get to set the regulations for nuclear power plants anymore. It put the ONDA under the authority of the health department for some reason. And he changed the procedure to pick the members of the ONDA, Ohio Nuclear Development Authority. In the old bill, he was restricted to hiring only members of the nuclear industry, and those members could still be employed by the nuclear industry. Now, he could still hire those people. He could certainly still put Energy Harbor's CEO on the Nuclear Development Authority, but he's not restricted to that anymore. He removed the restrictions. So basically, the governor gets to appoint whoever he wants. So they took out a lot of the very worst parts of this bill, but they still created the Ohio Nuclear Development Authority, and so it'll be a multi-million-dollar entity, and its job will now be promoting nuclear power. It's probably going to be hidden in the job services part of the government, which means it probably won't have to have open meetings or public comments or anything like that. So it becomes kind of a secret organization that will be promoting nuclear power, and it joins a tremendous list of government agencies already promoting nuclear power. The federal government, of course, has the Office of Nuclear Energy, whose sole purpose is to promote nuclear power. It has the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who is supposed to both regulate and promote nuclear power. The Energy Department is now a huge cheerleader for nuclear power under the current administration. And it's important to remember that the presidency itself has now become a nuclear power promoter. In fact, pretty much whenever he goes to another country, one of the things that Biden talks to the different prime ministers or presidents about is promoting nuclear power and trying to get them to buy American nuclear technology. And this has actually happened in country after country, like Poland has committed to buying a whole bunch of American nukes, Ukraine. And so we sort of have Ukraine over a barrel, right? It's like, oh, you like all these weapons we've given you, right? You want some of our nuclear tech, right? You're going to buy some of that, aren't you? And they do. They agree. Agreeing to go to nuclear power is basically agreeing to do nothing about global warming for the next decade or so, since it takes about a decade to build a nuclear plant, especially these new ones that have the small modular reactors, which economically are insane because they're way more expensive per kilowatt hour than big plants, but they haven't even been designed yet. So they're not off the drawing boards. So it's going to be at least another decades before they start coming online. And they even admit that in their timelines. So in other words, our government at the federal and now the state level is promoting the slowest, most expensive, dirtiest, most dangerous technology, even as we have wind and solar exploding around the world and actually taking us towards a carbon-free future. So this is a terrible bill. The governor should have just vetoed the whole thing outright. Instead, he kept the ability to appoint people he wants into these cushy nuclear development authority positions. So now on another related nuclear topic, one of the things that the federal government does, one of the most important subsidies for nuclear power, is the fact that the federal government limits the liability of nuclear companies to $13 billion in the case of an accident. Now, we know based on Fukushima, that is not even a tenth of the actual damages if there's going to be a meltdown. But the law that does that is up for renewal this year. And so our good friend at NIRS, Diane D'Arrigo, is leading the fight to get that subsidy removed. We, the taxpayers, should not be on the hook for the disasters of the nuclear industry. So let's go to our interview with Diane D'Arrigo.
Hi, yes, this is Diane D'Arrigo. I'm with Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS, and it's a national organization that fights nuclear power, nuclear waste, and radiation issues, man-made radiation, and I am the Radioactive Waste Project Director.
NIRS, or NIRS, has recently sent out an action alert on something called S1111. Could you please tell us what S1111 is and why it is so important?
Well, we usually say S1111 or 1111, but 1111 is correct. Anyway, this is a bill in the United States Senate that has already passed through the committee and is on its way to the floor of the U.S. Senate, which would do a bunch of things, a bunch of pro-nuclear, nuclear power activities. The major one is something that is absolutely essential for both old and new nuclear power, which is renewing the limit on their liability. Nuclear power accidents, nuclear waste accidents could cost a lot of money, into the billions of dollars. The nuclear industry does not have to buy insurance for this because the U.S. taxpayers, we are covering whatever the liabilities are. So the Price-Anderson Act is an old law that has been around since the beginning of nuclear power, and it expires in 2025. This would extend, this bill, S1111, would extend the limit on liability for nuclear power for another 20 years. And new nuclear could not start up without it. Old nuclear would have to be much more careful. So what this means is that nuclear is not competing fairly with other energy sources. This is a huge subsidy to the nuclear power industry. If there is a nuclear accident or disaster, they are limited. The nuclear industry is limited to $13 billion. And that is, if the accident costs go above that, then the U.S. taxpayers pay the rest. So the industry has limited liability, nuclear industry, and the S1111 extends this liability limit for 20 more years. So that's the major thing that the industry wants out of this bill. There are a couple of other things that it does, several other things. Right now in the United States, nuclear power plants cannot be owned by foreign owners. There's a ban on foreign ownership.
Okay.
This bill would overturn the ban. So it means that other countries could own nuclear power reactors in the United States. And that's a dangerous proposition. And then there's another provision in here. It promotes exporting nuclear technologies and nuclear materials to other countries. So what we really want to do, if we want to protect the planet, is to prevent the spread of nuclear materials and nuclear dangers. And yet this would allow for exporting nuclear technology and materials to other countries. It also would, there are several other problematic provisions with nuclear fuel. They would allow for higher concentration nuclear fuel, which could lead to a connection to proliferation with nuclear weapons. And I think the main thing is really the Price-Anderson liability limit. But these other things are also things that the industry wants. It would also, there are some monies that would go to start doing uranium mine cleanups, but not enough to really do a lot. It's at least a start on that. But the big provision here is limited liability.
Okay. So please, I mean, if you can also tell us like how S1111 caps nuclear industry damages from a nuclear plant disaster at around $13 billion. Isn't that a ridiculously low number?
It is a very low number. The Fukushima disaster just already over $87 billion have been spent on that disaster, that nuclear power, the meltdowns, since in the past 12 years, since the accident started in 2011. And it's projected, different projections, that the costs will be over $200 billion in the longer run. So capping it at $13 billion means that the industry is definitely not going to have to pay. If there's any payment that does go out, it'll come from our tax dollars, which are not allotted for that right now. The Chernobyl meltdown from 1986, it's in the range of $235 billion. And that is continuing to require management and control. And of course, I'm sure things got worse when the Russian troops came in and took it over. And I think I don't know what the current amount is, but I'm just comparing $13 billion to what the costs have been at two of the major nuclear disasters in the world. And that's clearly not going to be enough. And anything that does get paid out beyond that, we pay for in our tax dollars. We don't have enough money to put into certain activities that we think are important, but now it's all going to be taken away. It would be taken away in the incident of an accident like this in the U.S.
As a layman, or as a common person who loves planet Earth, his ecology and environment, I understand that $13 billion for nuclear damage is very low. Although these $13 billion can be compensated, the damage done to the planet Earth, the environment, that will take much long to compensate.
Right. The areas around Fukushima and Chernobyl, where the nuclear meltdowns took place, complete nuclear meltdowns, that land will be uninhabitable potentially forever, because nuclear power, it makes hundreds of radioactive elements, and some of those elements last into the millions of years. So N-129 is going to be hazardous for 170 million years. So the 340 million years just for that one isotope. And iodine's dangerous if it gets in the food chain, if it gets in our thyroids. It's biologically active. And there are hundreds of radioactive elements that are churning around in nuclear reactors.
Thank you very much, Dan. So this brings to my next question. Wasn't the special treatment like this only supposed to help the nuclear industry get started? The nuclear industry has been around for almost 70 years already. Should it be able to stand on its own by now, don't you think?
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
As we're talking about the claims by proponents of new nuclear, they're calling it advanced nuclear or small modular reactors. They're claiming that it's so much safer. Well, if it's safe, then why do we need to continue to subsidize the liability? The reality is that those new reactors are actually, if they ever get finished being designed and get licensed and built and operated, that they will not help climate change. They're going to be way too late, and they will actually create more radioactive waste, more volume and more radioactivity in the waste. This is from a report that came out about 6 months ago, reassessing the dangers of the waste from the proposed new nuclear reactors. So the new reactors are going to be, if they, according to the industry pipe dream, would be spread all around the country. We'd have more contaminated areas. We'd have nuclear waste in many different locations. We still don't have a place to try to isolate all of the waste that has been generated. So this special treatment is continuing, exempting this industry from liability. I am not aware of other industries having limited liability and the government covering the costs beyond that. It's probably because of the clear connection, well, sometimes the covered up connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And because the government really wants nuclear weapons, they're willing to do whatever it takes to have a nuclear power industry to support them.
So please tell us, what are some of the other special advantages or subsidies that nuclear power receives?
Nuclear power creates radioactive waste, and the federal government, U.S. government, will be taking, once there's a permanent repository, the federal government is going to take full liability and responsibility for that waste. This waste, as I mentioned, like the reactors themselves, the radionuclides, will be dangerous into the millions of years, hundreds of thousands to millions of years, that it needs to be isolated to the best of our ability from the environment. We don't have a permanent repository to try to isolate it. We have it sitting at all the reactors where it was generated, most of the reactors where it was generated, and new reactors will also have it there. There are efforts to try to bring it to a supposedly interim site. We've talked about that on this show in the past, the so-called consolidated interim storage. But that is still, right now, the waste is the liability of the private companies that generated it. However, in the long run, nuclear power waste is subsidized. It's taken care of by the U.S. taxpayers. The so-called low-level waste, this is all the other waste beside the irradiated or spent fuel, the reactors themselves. States were supposed to help provide for disposal of that waste. And Ohio was in the bullseye of the target to become a nuclear dump state for quite a few years. They did end up averting or preventing that, and now the waste goes to other states. But in essence, the long-term liability is going to sites in states where the states have liability for the dump. So the liability and costs of nuclear power and all of its waste are limited or taken over fully by the state and federal governments.
Okay. So please, if you can tell us how us or any of the audience listening to us, what should they do if they want to speak about S1111?
Okay, because this is a U.S. Senate bill, your U.S. Senators Vance and Brown need to hear from people against, tell them to vote no on S1111. That's U.S. Senator Vance and U.S. Senator Brown. Down the pike, it's possible that there will be a version of this in the House. Right now, the U.S. House of Representatives does not have a companion bill, but if it gets that far, then we'll be asking folks to tell your representatives to stop this renewal of Price-Anderson. At this point, it's tell your senators, Vance and Brown, no on S1111.
Okay. How can someone find out what NIRS, NIRS is doing?
We have a website, www.nirs.org. And if you go to that page, you can see what, some of the things we're working on. And there is a little tab that you can click to receive alerts. And we send out alerts, so maybe one every week or two. Occasionally there'll be two in a week, but it's a low flow email, but it's keeping you up on what the current actions are that can be taken to watchdog and protect ourselves from nuclear power and nuclear waste.
Thank you again for answering all the questions and sparing your time. And special thank you for leaving us with a food of thought, something to ponder and reflect upon, especially S1111. Thank you once again, Diana. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Great to talk to you. See you later. Bye-bye.
All right. We always love having Diane on the show. So much knowledge about environmental impacts of nuclear pollution, and just a great guest. We're glad you're able to listen. And we're also glad that we have our advertisers and patrons. And we could not bring this show to you without them and their support. So let's go to our advertisers right now.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
For Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons. And those are folks who've gone to patreon.com. That's Patreon.com DeWine. And there they searched for a green future. Up popped our Patreon page, and they simply picked a monthly level of donation that matched their budget. And every month now, a little bit comes out of their accounts, it comes over to us, and that's how we could afford to keep this show on the air. And we just want to thank our patrons. They are people who show vision and understand that if we really have any shot at having a green future, programs like this one, voices like this one, have to be heard, and we're in danger of being drowned out in the mainstream media. So, here we go with ecological news. And we're going to lead off this week with a story from Politico. On July 1st, there was a story by Corbin Hayar, and the title is White House cautiously opens the door to study blocking sun's rays to slow global warming. In other words, geoengineering. The White House is going to study the idea of blocking the energy from the sun in order to cool the earth down from global warming. And one interesting thing about this announcement by the White House is that they're trying to change the word being used. The word, when you talk about trying to rejigger the whole atmosphere of the planet, is geoengineering. What the White House wants everybody to start calling it is solar radiation modification, or SRM. So there's an acronym you could feel free to ignore, because geoengineering is a much more accurate description of what's going on there. And we've talked about geoengineering before on this show. Basically, it's insane. It's a mad scientist scheme to try to block the amount of sunlight coming into the earth in order to cool the earth down. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons this doesn't make any sense. One of the main reasons, if you are really going to try to change the atmosphere on a global scale, you need to use tremendous amounts of energy to do that. Like if you're going to fly planes up into the stratosphere and spray sulfur dioxide particles out to block the sun's rays there, that you need a huge fleet of airplanes that are going to be putting tons of CO2 in the air. And similarly, there's a scheme to take seawater and spray it up into the atmosphere to make clouds, increasing the amount of clouds, and that also will take a whole lot of power. And plus, you got to manufacture these floating barges with pumps in them that spray water up into the air. Again, tons of CO2 released into the atmosphere in order to block the sun. And the biggest, philosophical idea is that you're trying to treat the symptom. You're trying to put stuff into the air to make the earth dimmer on the surface, more reflective out towards space, and you're not stopping the use of carbon. You're not stopping the cause. It's like someone with, it's like somebody who's an alcoholic who's got cirrhosis of the liver taking an antacid because it makes their stomach feel a little better for a little while. It does not solve the problem and gives the fossil fuel industry the cover it needs to keep putting CO2 up into the air until we basically don't have the ability to do this sort of thing anymore. The biggest reason all these geoengineering schemes, whether it's the atmospheric sulfur dioxide or some are suggesting we go back to using dirty diesel fuel again, because that creates a haze that supposedly blocks some sunlight. The reason none of these will work is that the basic problem isn't that there's too much sunlight reaching the earth. Okay, the amount of sunlight reaching the earth is has been pretty much the same for like 1 billion years. Okay, and it will stay pretty much the same for another 4 billion years or so. The problem is not too much sunlight reaching the Earth. The problem is that the heat can't escape back out into space, because the chemical composition of the atmosphere has changed. There's more CO2. It holds heat better than the other gases in the atmosphere. And so that's why the globe is heating up. It's not that there's too much sunlight. So just blocking sunlight isn't going to speed up the escape of heat out into space. And so, in other words, it won't work. It doesn't matter. It just won't work. But it's the favorite, one of the favorite things for fossil fuel companies is to study geoengineering. And there are those saying this is the last line of defense against runaway warming. But if you're to that point, geoengineering isn't gonna work. So let's hope they don't waste more time and energy on geoengineering the way they're wasting time and energy on nuclear power, even as wind and solar power are coming of age. Next story. This one comes to us by way of the Energy and Policy Institute. They have a story that was published July 3rd and then updated on July 4th. Gas industry, dark money groups influence seen in Ohio budget bill. And, we talk a lot about the nuclear industry's corrupting influence. Well, the fossil fuel industry is right up there alongside them. According to this article, there are provisions in the budget bill, another bill that couldn't get through the regular legislature, that is giving the the gas industry, basically $1 billion in something called the All Ohio Future Fund to help prepare sites in Ohio for major development projects. It's got $667 million allocated to it after the governor's partial veto. So only only 2/3 of $1 billion, not a whole billion. But the basic idea is that gas utilities could charge customers annually for their own gas infrastructure development. So in other words, charging customers directly for creating more natural gas infrastructure instead of having that as part of their operating expenses. In other words, making the customer pay the expenses and thereby increasing your company's profits. Now, this language was taken from House Bill 33, again, a bill that couldn't make it through the legislature and was stuck into the budget bill. This is largely the work, apparently, of a dark money group called the Empowerment Alliance. That does sound like an evil, dark money kind of organization, doesn't it? The Empowerment Alliance. Yes, and so they have a lobbyist who basically worked on trying to push HB 33 through the legislature, and his name's J. Robert Blazer, and he apparently managed to get his bill into the budget bill along with so many other evil bits of legislation that the Republicans are too embarrassed to talk about in front of the voters. And this is the kind of corruption you get when you have a supermajority for years and years and years. I mean, when legislators really no longer fear elections, no longer think about what the people want, they fall in with these lobbyists and these corporations and you start working for them. This organization, the Empowerment Alliance, supported Republican candidates in the 2022 election, and they pushed a new law, the Ohio law that defines methane, defines natural fossil fuel gas as green energy. And their other goal of this organization is to block communities and states and that want to go to 100% renewable energy. This is an organization that's convincing Republican legislatures around the world, around the country, to pass laws blocking communities from going to 100% renewable energy. In other words, they're putting into law continued use of fossil fuels, even as we're basically cooking here. So it's evil. It's just another really bad thing that got stuck into the budget bill. But it's definitely worth noting because it's this sort of corruption that has led us to the current situation. Everybody blames the public. It's like people don't care. People are just going to keep using their gas heaters and all this. People do care, but our political leadership is literally mandating that we don't change because of laws like this and organizations like the Empowerment Alliance. So, on to our next story, which is another illustration of this idea. Michigan Republicans deny global warming. Our neighbors to the north in Michigan are considering clean energy legislation to combat global warming. And during hearings on the bill, a Republican legislator from Michigan's Upper Peninsula testified that global warming was just a theory. He said that if the state transitioned to wind and solar power, there would be so many blackouts that the food in people's refrigerators and freezers would spoil. Copying Texas Republicans, who last year blamed wind and solar power for blackouts that caused hundreds of deaths, Representative David Preston also blamed Michigan's wind and solar energy for blackouts that happened during the winter ice storms this past February that caused week-long blackouts for hundreds of thousands of Michiganders. Of course, actual studies have shown that it was Texas's nuclear and gas plants that failed. Both wind and solar outperformed nuclear gas in the crisis, and I'm sure the same was true in Michigan this past February. Wind and solar are turning out to be more dependable than fossil fuels or nuclear energy. Now, another Republican up there in Michigan during the hearings, Pat Outman, actually disrupted the hearings by speaking out of turn and shouting, and basically tried to shout down any representatives who were testifying about the bill. Outman, he was trying to prevent Democrats from even speaking about rising temperatures. This is especially ironic since Michigan is experiencing climate change-induced wildfires right this minute. Michigan is literally burning down around them, but the Republicans can't accept the idea that global warming is real. Of course, one of the main Democratic responses to global warming is the irrational return to nuclear power, but we don't need to talk about that right now. Okay, next story. Federal officials to start moving endangered species around. Okay, now, many baby boomers grew up watching a program called Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. In that program, one of the stars was always catching animals that were in the path of a proposed road or maybe an area that was going to be flooded by a dam, and then they would move them to new quote-unquote safe locations. Of course, after catching them, the animals would get held up to the camera so that the viewers could get a good look at them. Now, one of the effects of climate change is that habitats are changing. So most habitats are becoming hotter and drier. So species are shifting away from the equator and towards the poles. Maple trees are an example of this. Maples are starting to grow farther north, even as they lose range to the south. However, it's not clear if maples, or any other species for that matter, could shift the range fast enough to avoid dying out completely. Species that are adapted to cold weather, the ones that already live in the far north, may simply disappear because their climate may change so much they can't survive. So, according to a June 30th article in phys.org, the federal government is changing its rules to allow moving plants and animal species, quote, as a last resort to prevent extinction. This kind of relocation has historically been opposed by conservationists and ecologists. Moving species, they argued, can basically turn the species that you put in the new place, you could turn them into an invasive species and have unintended consequences. Also, when endangered species are located in the path of some kind of development, like dams or mines or logging, endangered species, by law, their entire ecosystem in the range has to be protected in order to protect the species. So, having an endangered species can block a mine or a logging plan or a dam. But if the mining and logging companies can simply move the species that their exploitation threatens, that could basically open the door to massive habitat destruction. Because now, if moving endangered species becomes just sort of routine, now whenever a company wants to destroy an area that's got endangered species in it, they just rent some trucks and ship them somewhere else. So, making this the official government policy is actually bad ecological policy. The government has already begun doing this on a limited basis. In Hawaii, some islands where birds such as endangered tern species, some of those islands are threatened with being completely wiped out as the ocean levels rise because of the global warming. And the government has been trying to establish new colonies on different islands that are taller in the hopes of saving the species. But it does raise the specter of federal dollars that could be going towards habitat restoration, shifting instead to these big, huge, expensive operations to catch and move animals and plants to new areas as their old ranges become uninhabitable or get developed. So again, this is treating the symptom when what we need to do is treat the cause. And all of these things have the potential to end up hurting the endangered species and not helping them survive global warming at all. Because just because you move them doesn't mean they're going to thrive in the new location. Okay, next story. Dutch to study floating solar panels. So one of the main ways that we're trying to get off of carbon, of course, is increasing solar. And floating solar farms that float on water over lakes and canals have many benefits. By shading the water, the panels stay cooler, which helps them be more efficient. And this also could help a greater number of species survive, because if the water stays cooler, it holds more oxygen. More species can survive in the cooler water. Solar panels floating on water also prevents evaporation, which means that precious water doesn't simply evaporate away during droughts. And finally, putting the solar panels on water means that you don't have to put them over farmland or where there's forests. This land, or the area being covered by water, is already taken up by the water, so you don't have the complaints a lot of people have that solar panels are displacing farming. Okay, all that is good, but the full ecological impact of floating solar panel farms hasn't been studied. So we don't really know what the long-term effects are on the plants and animals that are living in the water that is being covered by solar panels. So the Netherlands Institute of Technology has begun a 2.8 million euro study on the full effects of floating solar farms. Now, ironically, environmental impacts have been used by clean energy opponents to try to stop wind and solar development. For example, they claimed there was a whole bunch of whales, increasing number of whale deaths this year could be blamed on research being done in preparation for creating a wind farm off the east coast of the U.S. But, similar studies of the effects of wind turbines in the ocean has found they actually provide more habitat for fish and invertebrates, leading to more abundant and healthier oceans. And so let's hope the current study finds similar results for floating solar farms, because they really can be an important part of the fighting global warming and preventing the catastrophe that we're racing towards. But we can't make any assumptions. We got to wait for the result of the studies. All right, and that brings us to our last story this week. This week are taking from ScienceDaily.com, and on June 27th they had a story called "Ask Us How to Build the Circular Economy, Say Scientists." Basically, scientists have been studying the problems of sustainability for decades, and there's a group called the International Society for Industrial Ecology, and they have said that basically the policymakers need to look at the people who've been doing the theory. And a lot of scientists have looked at a lot of our resource use and have come up with ways that we can really radically reduce our amount of pollution, radically reuse waste products from one industry as the raw materials for another industry. And they've looked at questions, like electric cars, which are great in terms of getting us off of fossil fuels, but it doesn't solve the problem of there being too many cars. So essentially, this has been a disconnect in our society for a long time now. There was this brief period back in the 70s when you would find scientists on Capitol Hill, and they would be helping the policymakers, the lawmakers, and then together they would be working with the industry. That's how we got the Clean Water Act, and that's how Lake Erie went from being dead, a sewer, to being a functional lake again. But the scientists have been banned from the halls of power for a long time. They've been replaced by industry lobbyists, and increasingly it's just corporations and lawmakers. And increasingly even the public is no longer being found there. So let's hope some policymakers pay attention to this report by the International Society for Industrial Ecology. Well, that's it for this week. See you next week's going to be a best of show, but then we'll be back the week after that.